Empires do not always begin to crack at the frontier. Sometimes, the fracture begins in something far smaller. A coin, a wage, a market stall. A hand that hesitates for half a second before accepting payment. Because the most dangerous moment in a monetary system is not when money disappears. It is when money still circulates, still bears the seal of authority, still passes from palm to palm, but no longer feels the same. That is when doubt enters ordinary life. A baker raises his price. A soldier stares at his pay. A merchant weighs silver more carefully than before. And somewhere beneath the rituals of empire, trust begins to thin. The Ottoman coin crisis was not only a story about metal. It was a story about power trying to preserve itself by quietly weakening the very thing that held trade, taxation, wages, and obedience together. And once a state begins to erode its own unit of trust, the damage does not remain inside the mint. It moves outward, into markets, into households, into the structure of rule itself. So the real question is not what a coin was worth. The real question is, what happens when an empire teaches its own people to doubt the money in their hands?
Every state needs money that people will trust, not admire, not celebrate. Trust. Because an empire is not held together by banners alone. It is held together by salaries paid on time, taxes accepted as valid, supplies purchased without hesitation, and orders backed by a unit of value people still believe in. That is the paradox. The state needs reliable money in order to rule. But the moment pressure becomes severe, war costs rise, revenues strain, and the treasury tightens, the temptation appears. Not to rebuild trust slowly, but to spend first, to stretch the coin, to preserve the appearance of payment, to keep the army moving, the officials working, the machinery of rule intact. In the short term, this can look like survival. Wages are still issued, accounts are still settled, authority still speaks in the language of stability. But underneath that surface, something more dangerous begins. The state is no longer protecting the measure of trust, it is consuming it. And once power begins financing itself by weakening the money that supports obedience, trade, and taxation, it does not solve the crisis. It moves the crisis. From the treasury into the market, from the market into daily life, and from daily life back into the strength of the state itself. To understand why the Ottoman coin crisis mattered, you have to see the scale of the system it threatened. This was not a small kingdom with a narrow local market. It was an empire stretched across continents, across ports, caravan routes, provincial towns, military roads, tax districts, and crowded commercial centers where goods, silver, grain, labor, and authority moved every day. The Ottoman world was vast. Its army was large. Its bureaucracy was layered. Its fiscal obligations were constant. And a machine of that size does not run on imperial will alone. It runs on repetition. Taxes collected on schedule. Wages paid without delay. Supplies purchased at expected value. Merchants accepting coin without stopping to question it. Officials recording payment. Soldiers trusting that service will still feed a household. That is what empire looks like beneath its banners. Not just conquest, coordination. Not just power, compliance organized through money. Because once rule extends across distance, language, class, and region, force is no longer enough. The state needs a common measure that can move through markets, offices, barracks, and homes, without breaking at every exchange. That measure was money. And when money begins to weaken inside an empire that large, the danger is not confined to the mint. The danger is that an entire system of daily coordination begins to lose its rhythm.
Empires rarely weaken all at once. More often, the pressure builds quietly. Inside budgets, supply chains, military payrolls, and the widening gap between what the state owes and what it can still command. For the Ottoman Empire, that pressure did not come from one source alone. War was expensive. Administration was expensive. Distance was expensive. Holding together a system this large meant feeding armies, moving supplies, paying officials, maintaining roads, securing provinces, and financing authority across a world that could not be ruled by decree alone. The treasury felt that strain first, not as spectacle, as arithmetic. Too many obligations, not enough reliable revenue, too much urgency, too little time. And this is where a strong empire begins to change in character. It is no longer simply managing wealth, it is searching for speed. Where can money be found quickly enough to preserve appearances, meet payments, and prevent the machinery of rule from slowing down? That question is dangerous, because once a state begins solving present pressure by weakening future trust, it is no longer drawing on strength. It is borrowing against confidence. Borrowing against the willingness of merchants to accept coin, of soldiers to trust wages, of households to believe tomorrow's money will still hold. This is the turning point. The empire still looks powerful from the outside, but inside, it has begun to fund the present by making the future more fragile. This is where the Ottoman coin crisis becomes visible. Not because money vanished, because it remained in circulation while changing in substance. The akçe still looked like money. It still carried authority. It still moved through wages, taxes, and trade. But it no longer held the same amount of silver. That was the rupture. Debasement sounds technical, almost administrative, as if this were merely a matter of minting policy. It was not. Because a coin is never just metal inside a stamp. It is a promise. A promise that the state will not quietly reduce the value of what it asks people to trust. A promise that payment today will still mean something tomorrow. A promise that the measure passing through the market has not been thinned behind the public's back. When the akçe was debased, the face of authority remained. The content changed first. And that is what made the crisis so dangerous. The empire could preserve the appearance of continuity while weakening the substance beneath it. The coin still said stability, but the silver said something else. So this was not only a minting adjustment, it was the gradual dilution of state credibility, struck into metal and placed directly into ordinary hands. Debasement works because the coin can remain familiar while its inner value changes. The stamp is still there. The authority is still there. The public face of money is still there. But inside, the silver content is lower. That is the mechanism. The state does not need to announce collapse. It only needs to keep payment moving. If the same amount of precious metal can be spread across more coins, then more wages can be issued, more obligations can be met, and more immediate pressure can be relieved. At first glance, that can seem almost practical, even rational. The army is still paid. Officials still receive salary. Suppliers are still compensated. The machinery of empire keeps turning, which is exactly why debasement is so tempting. It creates spending power in the present without requiring equivalent strength underneath. But that apparent solution has a hidden structure. The state gains room today by distributing loss tomorrow, not by absorbing the cost itself, but by sending it outward, into prices,
into trust, into every exchange that now rests on a weaker measure. So debasement is never just a mint decision. It is a political way of financing the present by quietly socializing the future damage across the entire society.
States can alter coinage at the mint, but they cannot control how quickly the market learns. Merchants notice first. Money changers notice first. Shopkeepers who handle coin all day notice first. And anyone holding better silver notices first. Not through theory, through touch, weight, sound, and repetition. A coin that looks official can still feel wrong in the hand. It can ring differently. It can weigh differently. It can invite just enough doubt to change behavior. And once that happens, the market begins to react on its own. The weaker coins keep moving. The better ones begin to disappear. They are hoarded, set aside, melted down, pulled out of ordinary exchange, and protected from a system that no longer deserves them. That is when the disorder begins. Not because trade stops all at once, because trust becomes uneven. One seller accepts, another hesitates. A money changer discounts. A merchant demands more. And every transaction starts carrying a small extra burden of suspicion. This is how monetary weakness escapes the mint. The market does not wait for official confirmation. It responds first. And when good money retreats while bad money dominates circulation, society begins to feel something deeper than inflation. It feels coordination breaking down in real time. This is the point where monetary weakness stops looking abstract. It leaves the mint. It leaves the treasury. It leaves the counting table. And it arrives where people actually live. In the market, in the wage pouch, in the price of bread, in the small transactions that make ordinary life feel stable from one day to the next. Most people do not argue about coinage policy. They do not speak in theories of debasement or monetary credibility. They notice something simpler. Their pay buys less. A seller hesitates longer. Food costs more than it used to. The same handful of coins no longer moves through the day with the same ease. That change is heavier than it looks. Because daily life depends on rhythm. You work, you are paid. You buy what the household needs. You expect the measure to hold long enough for tomorrow to resemble today. When money weakens, that rhythm begins to fray. Not all at once, but enough to make life harder to predict. And once ordinary exchange becomes less certain, anxiety spreads faster than any official decree can contain. People may never name the monetary mechanism behind it, but they feel its consequences immediately. In a weaker wage, in a thinner meal, in the quiet realization that money still circulates, yet no longer protects daily life the way it once did. The first people to feel this most sharply were often the ones paid by the state itself. Soldiers, officials, clerks, men whose households depended on wages fixed in coin, not on the flexibility to raise prices or withdraw better silver from circulation. On paper, the payment could remain the same purse, the same count, the same official promise. But the value inside it had changed. That is where injustice becomes dangerous, because nominal pay can preserve the appearance of order, while real pay quietly collapses underneath it. A soldier still receives wages. An official still receives salary. The record still shows payment made. And yet, the bread costs more. The market hesitates longer. The household buys less. So the state continues speaking in the language of stability, while the people who serve it begin living a different reality. That is not just economic pressure.
It is political corrosion. Because armies do not defend order on symbols alone. Officials do not administer obedience on ceremony alone. They do so on the expectation that service will still sustain life. Once that expectation weakens, resentment enters the machinery of rule itself. Not always as open revolt at first, more often as something quieter. Frustration, distrust, a slow-burning anger inside the very institutions meant to keep the empire intact.
The state did not only weaken its money, it weakened its own ability to collect power through money. Because taxes are not just amounts on record, they are claims on real value. And once the coin used to pay them becomes less trusted, the treasury can still receive payment while losing substance at the same time. That is the trap. Revenue continues to arrive, bags are filled, accounts are marked, officials report collection. But what reaches the treasury no longer carries the same real weight. So the empire begins to suffer a quieter form of fiscal erosion. It is not only spending through weaker coin, it is receiving through weaker coin as well. And that makes rule harder in both directions. If the state presses harder for taxes, resentment deepens. Collection becomes harsher. Provincial tension rises. The burden of weakness falls more visibly on the population. But if the state relaxes pressure, the machinery thins. Less reliable revenue means weaker administration, weaker supply, weaker enforcement, weaker reach. That is why monetary decay becomes political suffocation. Power is no longer choosing between good options. It is choosing which form of weakness it can survive. More coercion, and society hardens against it. Less coercion, and the state hollows from within. Once money stops carrying stable value, taxation stops being a clean instrument of rule. It becomes a source of friction between the empire and the people it still expects to obey. When trust in money declines, trade does not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It becomes harder to keep smooth. Contracts grow less stable. Prices become harder to anchor. Exchange begins to require more checking, more doubt, more adjustment than before. That matters because money is not only a way to buy goods, it is a way to reduce friction. It allows strangers to trade without renegotiating value every time. It allows merchants to plan. It allows suppliers to move goods. It allows households to compare, choose, and survive within a shared measure. Once that measure weakens, coordination begins to suffer. Not because everyone stops trading, because every transaction becomes less certain. A seller asks for more, a buyer hesitates. A contract written yesterday feels less reliable today. A shipment priced in coin no longer carries the same confidence by the time it arrives. And this is the deeper danger. Money was supposed to simplify cooperation across distance, class, and profession. Now it begins to introduce new tension into the very exchanges it once made easier. So the problem is no longer just inflation. It is social drag, a slow disorder in which commerce still moves, but with more suspicion, more delay, and more effort. And when money stops coordinating trust efficiently, society itself becomes harder to coordinate. By this point, the Ottoman coin crisis is no longer just a monetary problem. It has become a problem of rule. Because once people begin to doubt the money, they do not only doubt the coin, they begin to doubt the promise behind the coin. And that promise belongs to the state. A government can survive temporary hardship. It can survive war, shortage, even local unrest. What becomes far more dangerous is when its own instruments stop carrying credibility. Money had been one of those instruments, not only a medium of exchange,
but a daily signal that imperial authority still meant something concrete in the hand. Once that signal weakens, suspicion spreads quietly. If the coin is thinner than it claims, what else is weaker than it appears? If payment is less reliable than before, how stable is the order built on that payment? This is how monetary distrust becomes political fragility. Not all at once, not always through open rebellion, more often through a slow erosion of confidence in the state's word, its reach, its fairness, its capacity to keep promises across the empire. And that is the deeper escalation. The crisis is no longer confined to metal. It begins to enter obedience itself.
The Ottoman case was not unique. That is what makes it more serious. When empires become overstretched, monetary weakness often appears early, not because rulers misunderstand metal, but because money is one of the few instruments that can absorb pressure quickly while delaying the full political cost. Rome offers a familiar parallel. There, too, coinage could keep its public face while losing strength underneath. And there, too, the logic was painfully similar. Military expense, administrative burden, widening obligations, and a state trying to preserve continuity without admitting how much strain had already entered the system. This is the pattern worth noticing. When an empire grows heavy with commitments, money becomes a buffer, a place to hide pressure, a place to move loss, a place to preserve the appearance of order a little longer. Which is why debasement keeps returning across history. Not as a cultural accident, as a structural temptation. The details change, the symbols change, the mints, rulers, and regions change, but the underlying logic remains. When power is overloaded, money is often forced to carry what politics, taxation, and administration can no longer carry cleanly on their own. That is why the Ottoman coin crisis matters beyond Ottoman history. It reveals a recurring law of empire. When the system strains, money is often where the first concealed fracture appears.
In the end, money does not work only because of metal. It works because people expect other people to accept it tomorrow. That expectation is easy to miss when a system feels stable. A coin seems solid, a payment seems routine, a market seems natural. But beneath all of it is a shared belief, not only that the object has value, but that the value will still travel from hand to hand, from wage to bread, from tax to treasury, from promise to fulfillment. That is what trust really is in monetary life. A common expectation strong enough to let millions of ordinary exchanges happen without constant fear, bargaining, or suspicion. Once the state weakens money, it does not only reduce material content, it weakens that shared expectation. It teaches the market to question. It teaches households to doubt. It teaches merchants to protect themselves. And once enough people begin adjusting defensively, the smoothness of social life starts to fade. This is the deeper lesson. Money is not only a measure of value, it is a measure of mutual confidence. And when that confidence is damaged, the loss does not stay inside coinage. It spreads into the invisible coordination that keeps an empire and any society functioning without tearing itself apart. Today, money is no longer mainly silver in a purse, but the underlying logic has not changed. Modern monetary systems still live on trust, on coordination, on the belief that institutions remain capable of maintaining order long enough for promises made today to remain meaningful tomorrow. That is why this history still feels close. Inflation is not only about prices rising, it is also about confidence thinning. Currency credibility is not only a technical issue for central authorities. It shapes how households plan, how firms price, how lenders judge the future, and how societies decide whether the system still deserves patience. Debt deepens that tension. Because modern states, like old empires, must constantly persuade the present to believe in obligations extending into the future. And that persuasion becomes harder whenever money begins to feel less stable, less predictable, less trusted as a carrier of value across time. So the Ottoman story is not modern because our coins look the same. It is modern because the fragile thing beneath them remains the same. A monetary order survives when people believe the structure behind money is still credible. And when that belief weakens, history reminds us of something unsettling. The form of money can change completely, while the problem of trust remains almost unchanged.
In the end, the Ottoman coin crisis was never only about a diluted coin. It was about a diluted foundation of trust. That is the part history can hide if we look only at metal, minting, and policy. An empire can still keep its banners. It can still pay officials. It can still march soldiers through ceremonial space. It can still preserve the language of order. And yet, something essential may already be slipping away. Because power does not survive on symbols alone. It survives when the measures people use every day still feel credible. When wages still mean security. When taxes still feel legible. When markets still clear without constant suspicion. When money still carries the promise that tomorrow will not suddenly break from today. Once that promise weakens, society does not fall apart in a single instant, but it begins quietly to loosen. Trust thins, coordination frays, obedience becomes harder to sustain, and the state starts losing its grip not only on money, but on the social order money once helped hold together. That is why this story matters. The Ottoman Empire did not merely weaken its coinage. It slowly weakened belief in the very instrument through which its authority reached ordinary life. And when money is no longer trusted, the empire may still appear intact from above, but below, society has already begun to slip from its hands.